The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crumpled and stained, as if it had fought its way through a storm to reach Evelyn Harper's doorstep in New Orleans. "Mom, I'm alive. I need you," it read, signed by her son, Caleb, whom she hadn't seen in 3 years. Not since she'd slammed the door on him, her voice trembling with rage, calling his love a sin. Now those words haunted her, clawing at the edges of her pride as she stood frozen, the paper shaking in her hands. Evelyn, 52, a black woman with a spine of steel and a heart hardened by years of rigid faith, had built her life on certainties. She ran a small bakery in the French Quarter, where the scent of pralines and beignets clung to her like a second skin. Her world was one of tradition, of church hymns and community respect, until Caleb, at 22, had sat her down and told her he was gay. She'd reacted with fury, not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't reconcile his truth with the beliefs she'd clung to like a lifeline. She'd sent him away, thinking distance would protect her from the shame she feared. Now, the letter hinted at a crisis, and Evelyn's carefully constructed world began to crack. The New Orleans air was thick with humidity as Evelyn walked to her bakery that morning, the letter tucked into her purse like a guilty secret. The city pulsed around her, street musicians coaxing soulful notes from trumpets, tourists weaving through the cobblestone streets, the Mississippi River glinting in the distance. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the last time she'd seen Caleb. He'd stood in her kitchen, his dark eyes, so like her own, pleading for understanding. "I'm still your son," he'd said, voice breaking. She'd turned away, unable to face the vulnerability in his gaze. Now the letter's words, "I need you," burned in her chest. At the bakery, Evelyn's assistant, Marisol, a 30-year-old Dominican woman with a sharp wit and a knack for reading people, noticed her distraction. "You okay, Evie?" she asked, kneading dough with practiced hands. Evelyn forced a smile, but her hands trembled as she iced a cake. She couldn't shake the image of Caleb, alone somewhere, in trouble. The letter had given no details, only an address in San Francisco and a plea to come quickly. San Francisco, 1,900 miles away, a world apart from her life here. She hadn't left Louisiana in decades. The thought of stepping into Caleb's world, one she'd rejected so fiercely, filled her with dread. That night, Evelyn sat in her small apartment above the bakery, the letter spread out on her kitchen table. She traced Caleb's handwriting, each loop and curve a reminder of the boy she'd raised, bright, kind, always sketching in his notebook or humming jazz tunes. She'd loved him fiercely, but when he'd come out, her fear of judgment had outweighed her love. Her church, her neighbors, her own mother's voice in her head, all had warned her against that lifestyle. She'd chosen pride over her son, and now that choice felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision. She couldn't ignore Caleb's call, not this time. She booked a flight to San Francisco, her hands shaking as she entered her credit card details. Marisol agreed to run the bakery in her absence, her dark eyes softening with concern. "Go find your boy," she said, squeezing Evelyn's hand. As the plane lifted off, Evelyn stared out the window, the patchwork of Louisiana fading below. She didn't know what she'd find in San Francisco, but the weight of her past decisions pressed against her chest, demanding answers. San Francisco greeted her with a chill she wasn't used to, the fog rolling in like a living thing. The address Caleb had given led her to a small, colorful house in the Castro district, its rainbow flags fluttering defiantly in the breeze. Evelyn hesitated at the door, her heart pounding. What would she say? Could she face him after all she'd done? Before she could knock, The door opened, and there stood Caleb, 25 now, taller and leaner than she remembered. His skin a warm brown, his eyes still carrying that spark of her own. But there was something else, exhaustion, maybe fear. "Mom," he whispered, and the sound broke something inside her. Caleb led her inside, where the air smelled of coffee and paint. The living room was cluttered with art supplies, canvases leaning against walls, sketches of cityscapes and faces pinned to a corkboard. He introduced her to Javier, his partner, a 27-year-old Latino man with kind eyes and a quiet strength. Javier offered a hesitant smile, but Evelyn's throat tightened. This was the life she'd rejected, the love she'd called wrong. Yet here, in this small house, she saw something she hadn't expected. A home, filled with warmth and care. "Caleb, why am I here?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Caleb's face fell, and he gestured to a couch. As they sat, he told her the truth. He was sick. A rare autoimmune condition, diagnosed months ago, was draining his strength. Treatment was expensive, and his insurance barely covered it. He'd written to her not just for help, but because he didn't know how much time he had. "I didn't want to die without seeing you again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's world tilted. Her son, her only child, was fighting for his life, and she'd spent years pushing him away. The guilt was a physical ache, but so was her pride, still whispering that she couldn't accept this, him, Javier, their life together. She looked at Caleb, his hands trembling slightly, and at Javier, who sat protectively close, his love for Caleb undeniable. For the first time, Evelyn wondered if her pride was worth more than her son's life. That night, Evelyn lay awake in the guest room of Caleb's house. The city's hum a stark contrast to the quiet of her New Orleans apartment. The walls were adorned with Caleb's artwork. Vivid paintings of San Francisco's hills, of Javier laughing, of moments Evelyn had never been part of. Each brushstroke felt like a rebuke, a reminder of the years she'd lost to her own stubbornness. In the morning, Caleb took her to a local cafe, a cozy spot with mismatched chairs and a mural of the Golden Gate Bridge. He moved slowly, his energy fading, but his smile was bright as he introduced her to his friends. Lena, a 29-year-old trans woman with a sharp laugh and a knack for storytelling, and Marcus, a 32-year-old black man who ran a community center for queer youth. They welcomed Evelyn with cautious warmth, but she felt like an outsider, her discomfort a weight she couldn't shake. These were Caleb's people, his chosen family, and she'd spent years denying their existence. Over coffee, Caleb shared more about his life. He worked as a graphic designer, pouring his heart into his art. Javier, a social worker, spent his days helping at-risk kids. Their life was one of struggle but also of love, of building something beautiful despite the world's judgment. Evelyn listened, her heart torn between admiration and resistance. She wanted to reach for Caleb, to hold him like she had when he was small, but the wall she'd built between them felt insurmountable. Later, at the hospital for Caleb's appointment, Evelyn sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly. The doctor, a kind-eyed woman named Dr. Patel, explained the treatment plan. Aggressive medication, possible surgery, and a long road ahead. The costs were staggering, and Caleb's savings were nearly gone. Javier had been working extra hours, but it wasn't enough. Evelyn's mind raced. She had savings, enough to help, but giving it would mean stepping fully into Caleb's world, acknowledging his life, his love, his truth. Back at the house, Evelyn found herself alone with Javier. The air was tense, his gaze steady but guarded. "I know you don't approve of me," he said quietly, chopping vegetables for dinner. But I love Caleb. I'd do anything for him. Evelyn wanted to argue, to cling to her old beliefs, but Javier's words cut through her defenses. She saw the way he looked at Caleb, the same way she'd once looked at her late husband, fierce, unwavering, true. That evening, Caleb showed Evelyn a photo album, its pages filled with memories. Him and Javier at Pride, their first apartment, a trip to the coast. Each photo was a piece of a life she'd refused to see. I wanted you to be part of this, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. But I couldn't wait for you to change your mind. Evelyn's eyes burned with tears, but her pride held them back. She wanted to say she was sorry, but the words stuck in her throat. The next day, Evelyn joined Caleb and Javier at a fundraiser for the community center Marcus ran. The event was vibrant, filled with music, laughter, and stories of resilience. Evelyn watched as Caleb spoke to a group of teens, his warmth drawing them in. One girl, barely 16, shared how the center had saved her after her family rejected her. Evelyn's heart clenched. She saw herself in that story, the parent who'd chosen pride over love. For the first time, she felt the weight of her choices not just as a mother, but as a human being. As the fundraiser ended, Caleb collapsed. The crowd parted as Javier rushed to his side, panic in his eyes. Evelyn froze, her breath caught, watching as paramedics arrived. At the hospital, Dr. Patel's face was grim. Caleb's condition had worsened. He needed surgery soon or he might not survive. Evelyn stood by his bed, his hand limp in hers, and the reality crashed over her. Her son was slipping away, and her pride could cost her everything. The hospital room was sterile, its white walls and beeping machines a stark contrast to the colorful chaos of Caleb's home. Evelyn sat by his bedside, her hand gripping his, her mind a storm of fear and regret. Caleb was stable, but weak, his face pale against the hospital sheets. Javier sat on the other side, his eyes red from sleepless nights, his love for Caleb a quiet, unshakable force. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled back to her own childhood in New Orleans, raised by a mother who saw the world in black and white. Sin was sin, her mother had taught her, and Evelyn had carried that lesson into her own parenting. But now, watching Caleb fight for each breath, she wondered if those lessons had been a cage, not a guide. She'd pushed her son away to protect her own sense of rightness. But what was rightness worth if it left her alone, clutching a dying child's hand? Javier broke the silence. He talks about you, even after everything. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made Evelyn flinch. He kept hoping you'd come around. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself, but the truth in his words silenced her. She'd built a wall of pride, and now it was crumbling, leaving her exposed. The next day, Evelyn met Lena at a nearby diner to talk about the fundraiser. Lena's energy was infectious, her stories of the community center filled with hope. "We're family here," she said, her eyes bright. "Not by blood, but by choice." Evelyn thought of her own family, fractured by her choices, and felt a pang of envy for the bond Lena described. She wanted to be part of Caleb's world, but she didn't know how to cross the chasm she'd created. Back at the hospital, Caleb was awake, his voice weak but clear. "Mom, why did you come?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Evelyn hesitated, the truth too raw to speak. She'd come because she couldn't lose him, because the letter had shattered her defenses, because she was terrified of a world without him. But saying that meant admitting she'd been wrong, and her pride still clung to her like a shadow. Instead, she asked about his art, a safer topic. Caleb's face lit up as he described a mural he'd been planning for the community center. A tribute to resilience and love. "I want to leave something behind," he said, his voice breaking. "Something that matters." Evelyn's heart ached. She saw his strength, his beauty, and hated herself for ever thinking it was wrong. That night, Evelyn walked the streets of the Castro, the rainbow flags a vibrant contrast to the fog. She passed bars and shops, heard laughter and music, saw couples holding hands without fear. It was a world she'd been taught to condemn, but here, it felt alive, human, real. She stopped at a mural, its colors bold and unapologetic, and saw Caleb's signature in the corner. Tears fell, hot and unstoppable. She'd been so wrong, and the cost was her son's trust, maybe his life. The next morning, Evelyn made a choice. She called her bank and transferred her savings, every cent she'd saved for her own future, to cover Caleb's surgery. It was a leap, one that left her vulnerable, but it was the only way she knew to show him she was trying. When she told Javier, his eyes softened, and for the first time, he hugged her. "Thank you," he whispered, and Evelyn felt a crack in the wall between them. Caleb's surgery was scheduled for the next day. Evelyn stayed by his side, reading to him from a book of poetry he loved, her voice trembling but steady. She didn't know if she could repair the past, but she could be here now, holding his hand, choosing him over her pride. The surgery lasted 6 hours, each minute an eternity for Evelyn. She sat in the waiting room with Javier, the silence between them heavy but no longer hostile. They didn't speak much, but when their eyes met, there was an understanding, a shared fear, a shared love for Caleb. Evelyn clutched a small sketchbook Caleb had given her, its pages filled with his drawings, a lifeline to the son she was fighting to keep. When Dr. Patel emerged, her face was cautiously optimistic. The surgery had gone well, but Caleb's recovery would be long and uncertain. Evelyn felt relief, but it was tempered by the weight of what came next. She couldn't return to New Orleans, not yet. She needed to stay, to rebuild what she'd broken, to learn how to be a mother again. The first time Caleb opened his eyes after surgery, Evelyn was there. His smile was weak but real, and when he squeezed her hand, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. "You stayed," he whispered, and the words were both a question and a gift. Evelyn nodded, tears spilling over. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and for the first time she meant it. Recovery was slow. Caleb spent weeks in the hospital, then months in physical therapy. Evelyn rented a small apartment nearby, using the last of her savings to cover the cost. She found a job at a local bakery, its pace slower than her own but enough to keep her afloat. Every day, she visited Caleb, bringing him sketches from his friends or stories from New Orleans. Javier was there too, his presence a quiet anchor, and slowly, Evelyn began to see him not as a threat, but as family. One afternoon, as Caleb napped, Javier invited Evelyn to the community center. Marcus gave her a tour, showing her the art room where Caleb had taught classes, the walls covered in murals by queer youth. "This is what Caleb built," Marcus said, pride in his voice. Evelyn felt a swell of emotion. Her son had created something beautiful, something that mattered, and she'd almost missed it. That evening, Evelyn joined Caleb and Javier for dinner at their house. It was a simple meal, but the act of sitting together, sharing stories, felt profound. Evelyn told them about her childhood, her fears, her regrets. For the first time, she spoke of her own mother's harshness, how it had shaped her, how she'd let it shape her choices with Caleb. I was wrong, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Caleb reached for her hand, and Javier's eyes were soft with understanding. As weeks turned to months, Evelyn became a part of their world. She attended events at the community center, met more of Caleb's friends, learned their stories. Lena taught her about resilience, Marcus about hope. She began to see the beauty in the life Caleb had built, the love he shared with Javier, the community that held them up. Her pride, once a fortress, was now a bridge, fragile but growing stronger. One day, Caleb showed her a new sketch, a portrait of her, smiling, with New Orleans in the background and San Francisco's hills in the foreground. "This is us," he said. "Both our homes." Evelyn's heart swelled. She was learning to love her son not in spite of who he was, but because of it. A year later, Evelyn stood in the community center, surrounded by laughter and music. The mural Caleb had dreamed of was complete, its colors a vibrant tribute to love and resilience, unveiled at a celebration for the center's anniversary. Caleb, stronger now, stood beside Javier, their hands intertwined, their smiles bright. Evelyn watched them, her heart full, her pride no longer a barrier but a part of her growth. She'd sold her bakery in New Orleans, a decision that had once terrified her but now felt right. She'd moved to San Francisco permanently, living close to Caleb and Javier, building a new life. Her apartment was small, but it was filled with pieces of her son's art, reminders of the love she'd almost lost. She worked part-time at the community center now, teaching baking classes to teens, sharing stories of her own journey. Each class was a step toward healing, a way to give back to the community that had opened her eyes. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Evelyn sat with Caleb and Javier on their porch, the air warm with the promise of spring. They talked about the future, plans for a trip to New Orleans, a new art project, maybe even a wedding. Evelyn listened, her heart light, no longer burdened by the need to control or judge. She'd learned that love wasn't about perfection, but about showing up, about choosing each other despite fear or doubt. Caleb turned to her, his eyes bright. "I'm glad you're here, Mom," he said. Evelyn smiled, tears in her eyes. "I'm glad I chose you," she replied. It was the truth she'd fought to reach, the one that had saved her as much as it had saved him. Her pride had once been her armor, but now, her love for her son was her strength. As the celebration wound down, Evelyn stood by the mural, tracing Caleb's signature. She thought of the letter that had brought her here, the plea that had forced her to face her own flaws. She'd come to San Francisco to save her son, but in the end, he'd saved her, by showing her what love could be, what it could overcome. The choice between her pride and her survival had been clear, and she'd chosen life, love, and her son. The night ended with music, with Caleb and Javier dancing under the stars, with Evelyn joining them, her laughter mingling with theirs. She'd lost years to her pride, but she'd gained something greater, a family, a purpose, a heart open to the world. And in that moment, surrounded by love, she knew she'd never turn back.